This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Good morning. So does the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, speak for all of us? He seems to feel pretty confident that he does when he says there is a willingness for us to pay more money in taxes, provided people can see that it's going to the NHS and that the money is not being wasted. What sort of money is Mr. Hunt talking about when he speaks on our behalf? Well, I'll tell you, he's talking about taxes needing to rise by up to £2,000 for every household. So is this something that you would be prepared to do? Are you prepared to pay more tax if you thought it would help the NHS? And if you feel you'd be happy to dig deeper, then call me on 0345 6060 973, or maybe you think, actually, you're paying enough tax as it is, in which case text to 84850, or maybe you're suspicious that actually that money isn't going to be very well spent, in which case tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course, you can't just watch us on Facebook only, you can comment using that medium too. So what do I make of all of this? Well, I have to say that I'm not convinced that just throwing vast sums of money at a problem is necessarily the right thing to do. I think we've seen, over the course of the last few months, for example, health tourism once again being spoken about, and we debated it, in fact, last Sunday on this show, and yet, within some parts of the National Health Service, almost no desire at all to deal with that issue, just easier to turn a blind eye. And also the whole drug procurement programme of the NHS, where in many cases drugs that can be bought quite cheaply over the counter are being sold to the NHS for vastly inflated sums. And all right, I get it, Jeremy Hunt. I know there is an ageing population. I know that there are now medical procedures available to people that simply didn't even exist a few decades ago. I understand there is a money problem. There is also, of course, an exploding population, which nobody talks about. They say there are 65 million people living in this country, but we all know the true figure is a fair bit higher than that. Compare that to 25 years ago, when it was 55 million. So, these are all very real issues. But I'm going to say no. I'm not happy, Mr. Hunt, for you to speak on my behalf. I don't think an extra £2,000 a year would actually get bang for the buck. But also, and here's a very important point, the idea that you pay a portion of your tax and that it directly goes to one part of government spending, it's called tax hypothecation. It doesn't exist. Even with the road tax, it doesn't go to pay for the roads. It just goes into the pot. National insurance, which was sold, of course, to the country back in the late 1940s as being the money that would be spent on the health service. Oh, no, it doesn't. It just all goes in to a great big central pot. The money goes into that pot, the expenditure comes out of it, and of course, because one doesn't meet the other, we have to go to the markets and borrow every year, and we're still running a deficit of about 50 billion sterling every single year, despite the fact that at every general election, we're told, during the lifetime of this Parliament, we'll end the deficit. But we don't. Tax hypothecation does not work. And it's cheaper, it really is sort of left-wing populism to say a penny on tax for schools or twopence on tax for the health service. It just doesn't work. And I'm amazed that a Conservative Party, who are supposed to be the ones, who know about financial responsibility, are even putting this idea forwards, though some cynics would say they aren't necessarily particularly conservative. Let's go to Terence, a first-time caller to this show. He's calling from Stoke Newington. Good morning, Terence.
Morning, Nigel.
So, would you be happy to pay £2,000 a year more from your household straight to the NHS?
Well, I've got 3 points to make, really.
OK.
The way forward that I see would be the best way forward is to, in first instance, have an entitlement card which meant that everybody that was entitled to use the NHS had a card to prove that they were entitled to use the NHS, leaving aside the issues of how we'd implement that, etc., for one moment. I think that would be a good idea. The second instance really follows on from what you said about the way tax and then national insurance all mingle together.
Yeah.
I would actually like to see on my monthly pay slip an actual amount of money that says specifically that I am paying X amount for the NHS. Then I think in terms of democracy, when there's an election, people can be told, we are going to spend X more amount on the NHS. That will mean that bit on your pay slip that says you're paying £2,000 a year or whatever for the NHS is going to go up by £200, £300. And I think people would start beginning to understand how much it actually costs to fund the NHS and would be able to make a democratic choice about how much money they wanted to put into it. And it might be that the British population is actually quite happy to put more money into that.
Right, so Terence, how long do you think that payslip would be? Because if the payslip told you how much went to the NHS, how much was spent on defence, how much went on...
No, that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting specifically...
Oh, no, you can't single out one area of one area of expenditure. I mean, that would be unfair to the other decisions that government needs to make, surely.
No, I don't think so. I think in the case of the NHS, we have one large national institution that we're all very proud of, that does a very good job for the country, etc. But I think when people talk about this 1 pence on income tax or NHS, etc., and they're basically, they don't know where the money's going. But if you knew that...
But you wouldn't know. But Terence, you wouldn't know because actually the money does come out of a central pot. It's almost impossible, Terence, without setting up whole new departments.
I wouldn't say it was impossible. I say that would be the way forward, because when you went to vote in the elections and the party said, we're going to spend so many more billion on the NHS, you would know that part of your contribution to society is coming out of that bit in your payslip that says NHS, and when it goes up, say, to 20 or 30...
But you pay another 200 quid in tax, and you might find that only 30 quid of it goes to the NHS.
Well, we've got to make sure that the money within that pot does go to the NHS.
Fine. Which needs setting up whole new government department, because you'd have to bypass the Treasury and all the existing apparatus that collects tax and spends money. I understand emotionally why people think it's a good idea. Paddy Ashdown did this back in the 90s with education. Penny on tax for education. These are cheap political sound bites, and I, Terence, would have expected better from a Conservative government. But listen, I thank you for your point, and we'll come back to Terence's point about entitlement cards, stroke ID cards, over the course of the programme. Cut overseas aid and stop HS2, says Frank from Ruislip. Oh, come on, Frank. HS2's only 60 billion quid, and think about it. I mean, you'll be in Birmingham 10 minutes more quickly. Surely worth every bean. Let's go to Lynn in Birmingham. I didn't even know I was going to Birmingham next. Lynn, after HS2, we're going to be with you more quickly from here.
Hello, Nigel.
Good morning.
Before I go on about the NHS, I agree with everything with you. So that's all I need to say.
Thank you.
My NHS.
Yes.
Now, my son died last October.
Sorry to hear that.
And it was through bad patient care. Now, I think I'm 81 years old, Nigel.
Yeah.
And I worked from 16 years old until 68 years old. And the care that I've had from the NHS has been an absolute disgrace. The care my son received in hospital for 5 weeks, I can't begin to tell you. So I think Mr. Jeremy Hunt, who incidentally I wrote to 4 times, who didn't even have the decency to write back and answer my letters, I consider that the money that I've paid in all my life, right to 68 years old, I should have had better care and attention in my life, as well as my son. That's really all I've got to say.
Is it possible, Lynn, and I'm sorry to hear you've had a very, very sad last few months, but is it possible, Lynn, that Jeremy Hunt would answer you by saying that if there was more money for the NHS, you both might have received better care.
Maybe, but I consider the nurses that were in... Do you know, Nigel, I don't want to go into it, but every day I went in to see my son, I went to the nurses' station every single day. There was no response. They didn't care. They were walking about. I consider that non-patient care.
Right.
And I will never forget it, because I consider the NHS, above anything, the best in the world. But what I received this last year, I'm sorry, I don't anymore. And I am disgusted by it.
Well,
and I do wish that Jeremy Hunt would do something about this, because it's going from bad to worse.
Well, maybe, Lynn, I don't know. That could be an argument for more money, but it could be an argument for reform and a change of culture. Lynn, I thank you for that sad story. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, and it's now 11:15. Is the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, right when he says we are willing to pay an extra £2,000 per household, on average, to the National Health Service, provided we know the money's going there and it's not going to be wasted? They're the caveats that he did put on. And I'm not convinced the money would get well spent. I'm not even convinced much of it would get there, because we don't have tax hypothecation. We don't pay X pennies in the pound to the health service, or Y to defence, or whatever else it may be. The system just doesn't work like that. And I have to say, I think for a, I'm not surprised Paddy Ashdown did it. He was never going to be in government. That was easy. That was easy for him to say a penny on health back in the 1990s. But I am surprised that a senior government minister is kind of suggesting this to people, because it just factually isn't true, given how our system works. I don't want to pay more, as there is too much waste in the NHS. What about the people who pay for private healthcare, says Claire. Well, Claire, I'd have thought the more people we can encourage to pay for private healthcare, the better, because that surely takes pressure off the National Health Service. Nigel, does the NHS need more money? The new sugar tax is a great example of how we can raise additional revenue. It will raise £250 million. Such taxes should be extended, such as an NHS levy on all junk food, alcohol and tobacco. Andrew, it doesn't work like that. I know this, in theory, sounds fantastic. All right, all tobacco taxation goes to the NHS, but it doesn't. It goes into a central pot. And by the way, for those, and this might surprise one or two of you, tobacco revenues, they're down a bit, mostly because the taxes are so high that people are buying smuggled goods increasingly. But tobacco taxes, roughly 10 to 11 billion pounds a year into the UK economy, and the cost of treating tobacco-related diseases, £2 to £2.5 billion every year. But it's still, these aren't direct trade-offs. That is not how our system works. I talked earlier, entitlement cards came up a bit earlier. Now, whether we call them ID cards or whether we have national insurance cards to which we add our photograph, I'm not sure. But I do begin to get the feeling, particularly as health tourism has been back on the agenda over the course of the last few weeks, I do begin to think there is a bit of public appetite out there for people to have entitlement cards. And I think if they did have them, maybe then, Jeremy Hunt, that might be one of the factors that makes them a little more willing to pay more tax. But up to £2,000 for every household, yep, we're living a long time, and we do face huge problems for the future. But the idea people would willingly pay it, and it would go from one to the other, I don't believe, is right. I really don't. Let's go to Alan in Hartlepool. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning, Nigel. Yeah, my point is, if the NHS is so desperate for cash, how is it they can afford to continue to pay six-figure salaries to chief executives? Like, for instance, the one we have in North...
I can't go into individual authorities, Alan, but the general point... Okay. Yeah, the general point... Yeah. No, look, you're absolutely right. Big money is paid to chief executives, and you say six-figure money. In some cases, very big six-figure money is paid. Alan, the argument you would get back from Jeremy Hunt and others is that if you pay the big bucks, you get people who are of very high quality, and they will make sure that the local area's health provision, and indeed where it sources its drugs from and its staff from, Alan, they will do the job so well that you may pay them a couple of £100,000, but they will effectively save the taxpayer millions. That's the argument, Alan.
Well, we know that's not true, don't we? You can't buy talent. We've seen that on the football field. It's the same with chief executives. Because they're paying all this money. So if that was the case, why aren't they paying nurses what they deserve instead of the 1% the increase they were on? While these chief executives and all the pen pushers and paper shufflers below them are all on fantastic money as well. It's totally out of balance.
Well, the thing, Alan, that gets me a bit about this is that since 1997, the growth of middle management staff in the NHS has been over 40%, and I just can't for the life of me work out how bureaucratic the whole thing has become. And I think, Alan, I tell you what, I personally actually don't mind paying chief executives well if they are going to save millions and millions, but I suspect that your suspicion that in many cases they're not doing that. Most people, Alan, would share your point of view. Thank you. Let's go to Catherine, who's calling from Romford. Good morning.
Hi, Nigel.
So would you be willing, Catherine, to pay more taxes if it went straight to the NHS?
In a word, no, because like you, I think there's a lot of wastage. I think that if I paid more money in tax, presumably for the NHS, I don't think that it would result in an increased quality of care. I think the money would go directly to these big pharmaceutical companies who are charging extortionate prices for drugs in some cases.
Yes, some of the examples are just extraordinary, aren't they? Of things that we could buy ourselves, Catherine, for a few pounds, over the counter in any well-known pharmacy chain, which then, when they're sourced to the NHS, in some cases cost hundreds.
Yes, exactly. And also other drugs like epilepsy drugs. Also, I specifically know about a thyroid drug called T3, where a company was charging a 6,000% price hike.
I saw that story too. Yeah.
So instead of the drug costing £25 a month, as it would be in many other countries in the world, it's costing £900 in the UK. So the NHS has been paying that. So I think we have to really get that under control before we start paying more in tax to the NHS.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, Catherine, a lot would argue we're paying enough already. But also, do you understand my point? And when I say that actually taxation goes into a central pot, it doesn't go directly to the health service or defence or anything else.
Yes, I would definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, and yet he's
very concerned that the money wouldn't get to the NHS.
Yeah, so he's kind of giving a slightly misleading view, isn't he, Jeremy Hunt, of the way in which government really operates.
Yes, because I don't see how they can guarantee that the money would go to the NHS.
Precisely. Under our system, it can't. Catherine, I thank you very much indeed for your call and your view. And Catherine's suspicious of where the money goes and how it is spent. Hi, Nigel. The NHS is part of a civil service and funded by government. But since Blair, the NHS has had a lot of changes. Now it is mismanaged by all the middle management that interfere in all aspects, is what Louise has to say. Mal on Facebook says, the NHS was not built for drug addicts, alcoholics or obesity. Well, Mal, it's a very interesting one. There is certainly a school of thought that is gaining ground that says that if people have self-inflicted illnesses through obesity or various forms of drug addiction, that the NHS shouldn't treat them. But Mal, we're a civilised society. We're not going to leave people to sort of die on the front doorstep. Oh, sorry, you've been drinking too much, we can't treat you. Although anyone that works in A&E would be pleased if the country as a whole drank less, given that on Friday and Saturday nights, a lot of them are frankly like war zones, and I wouldn't want to work in one. Whatever you paid me, it must be horrendous. Dave is calling from Hammersmith. Good morning, Dave.
Hi, Nigel.
So, come on, are you a big Jeremy Hunt supporter? You happy to shell out £2,000 for the NHS?
I'm not really a supporter. I think he's gone about this the whole wrong way.
Okay.
What he did, he started off by cutting money drastically. Probably, different numbers vary, but probably about 30 billion in real terms since 2010 because of the indexing. Now, when you give a set of managers, you run a business, you give a set of managers a job and you say, you've got to do the job with less money. What do? They don't sack themselves because turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And what we're talking about here is 415 boards of directors, 415 chief executives, 415 PR managers, 415 everything. They're making the same decisions. Is cancer more important than arthritis? Of course it is. Well, let's prioritise that then. These are the same decisions. You'd also, having run your own business and been in your own business, know that you focus on the big costs, the big mistakes costs, like PFI. There are clauses in PFI, non-performance clauses, that could be exercised to get rid of that complete. I mean, that's what bankrupts trusts, PFI. Now,
Dave, you're clearly very knowledgeable on this, but one or two hospitals that I've spoken to saying that these PFI deals, which were presented as some sort of miracle in the late 1990s, actually, the overhead of that is ruinous for many of the new build hospitals.
It is. They can't change a light bulb. £250 to get somebody in to change a light bulb. They can't change the thing that shuts a door. So then they can't use a whole room because they're breaching a fire regulation. The stuff that goes on is ridiculous. He cut the SHAs. So he cut those. Those very same people were paid 50 grand in redundancy only to be re-employed by GPs. He created a massive increase in the appetite for risk, and that's really what's at the core of the NHS. Do we let patients die? What's the risk factor? Now, at the same time, we had Blair to blame for a lot because he brought in a system that says your trust has a certain amount of money. Every time somebody elects to go for a private surgery, for a private thing, what happens is that money is taken out of the NHS budget for that trust and paid to that private institution. These so-called prices were put on those, and that's stealing money from.
So is Dave wholesale reform the first thing that needs to happen?
Well, I think, first of all, what you do is you say, right, so if you've got these private organisations who are taking clinicians out of the NHS for sometimes 4 to 5 days a week, and some of them keeping for 1 day a week to keep their pension alive, they should actually be paying. It costs over £5 million per doctor to actually train them. So they're not contributing to that. We have to have the teaching hospitals. We have to have the environment that teaches doctors. But the private people do not pay a penny towards it. But they're taking money.
Dave, the deeper you go into this, the more that needs to be done. Thank you. And in the interest of fairness, of course, it isn't just people like Jeremy Hunt, Remainers in modern parlance, who talk about more money for the NHS. Some will remember Boris Johnson talking about 350 million a week that could perhaps have been spent on the NHS. And you could argue that was a form of a promise of tax hypothecation, which is actually rather difficult to deliver. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 11:31. Well, Jeremy Hunt seems to speak for all of us, saying we'd be very happy to put more money into the National Health Service, perhaps up to £2,000 per household if we were happy it wasn't being wasted. Calls and texts and tweets I'm getting wouldn't necessarily back that up. Now, on Friday, a new piece of legislation came into being. The GDPR. It's been agreed at European Union level, and despite the fact we have a Brexit government, Mrs May has said we are not only opted into it now, we will stay a part of it. It is a piece of legislation that potentially affects a lot of you out there running businesses if you collect or keep data of any kind at all. Yeah, I feel, for one, there's been far too little explanation of what this is, and certainly polling that I've seen suggesting that a lot of businesses didn't even know it was happening. And surprisingly, over the course of this weekend, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and other big US news sites, if you go and try and find them, you get redirected to a page saying that at the moment they're unavailable. So a lot of US-based websites are currently, shut off to internet users across the European Union. So to examine both of these things, try and get some explanations, I'm going to go to Suzanne Dibble, a data protection lawyer. Good morning, Suzanne.
Good morning, Nigel.
Good morning. So am I right in saying that there's been too little explanation by government of this change in the law?
I would agree with that, Nigel. I run a Facebook group for 35,000 small business owners called GDPR for Online Entrepreneurs. And certainly there are still people coming into that group who have only just found out about GDPR. And they're in a panic because they know that the regulations came into force on Friday and they're already worried about being non-compliant and being fined 20 million euros. Now, of course, my approach in that group is very much to reassure them and to tell them that that isn't going to happen. But yes, I do absolutely agree with you that I feel that the government and the Information Commissioner's Office could have done a lot more to make particularly small businesses aware of it.
Yeah, and these fines are horrendous because, it can be up to 20 million that you can be fined, or 4% of your business. I mean, it's, and that is basically for not having sufficient consent, would you say, Suzanne? Is that the right way to describe how people's data needs to be accessed and used?
Well, GDPR is a lot more than the emails that we've seen into our inbox last week asking for consent. And the ICO have said that the maximum fines will be reserved for the most serious breaches. So, no, I think that not getting the right tick boxes is not going to end up with any kind of significant fine or possibly any fine at all. But it is obviously the headlines of the fines being 20 million or 4% of your global turnover. So in Facebook's case, for example, if they were levied the maximum fine, it would be $109 billion based on their last year's turnover. So yes, I mean, understandably, these headline fines are very concerning to small businesses. And although the ICO, to give them credit, have on every opportunity tried to reassure small businesses, unless small businesses are seeing the ICO's press release or going onto the website and reading it, what they're reading is in the newspapers in the last week or so, and understandably they're panicked about it.
Now, of course, legislation of all kinds often has unintended consequences. Why is it that the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and other American news sites are unavailable now for most of us living inside the European Union?
Well, I obviously don't know their internal workings. I can only guess that they're not as prepared for GDPR as they hoped they'd be. However, they do say that they're engaged on the issue and committed to looking at options that support their full range of digital offerings in the EU market. So I can only assume that maybe they weren't aware of it as soon as they should have been.
But Suzanne, these are
complex data business.
But these are
time to comply.
These are big, rich media organisations. I find it.
Yes, you would have hoped that they'd been ready. But I think, the message certainly is not that they are cutting off their EU market. And I think it's what I see in my Facebook group, and we're getting more and more US companies joining by the day. But the initial knee-jerk reaction when they hear the headline fines of 20 million is to think, right, well, I'm just going to block the EU. But once they actually realise that it isn't so arduous to comply, they soon realise that actually keeping their audience of a potential 500 million users in the EU is far preferable to cutting them off.
OK, and finally, Suzanne, a personal view from you. Do you think this general data protection requirement is the right way for us to go?
I do. It's coming from a very good place. If you think about it as a data subject, I'm personally very reassured that organisations are going to be a lot more focused on keeping that data secure. If you think about it, data has changed so much in the last 20 years since our last data protection laws came in. The value of data, data is now the most valuable asset in the world, and the way that we process it is significantly different to how it was 20 years ago. So yes, it's coming from a very good place, this regulation. It's just I think that we'll see a few teething problems in implementing it. And the ICO has stated this is not the deadline of the 25th, it's not the end, it's the beginning. And I think that putting privacy and data protection at the heart of organisations can only be good for the data subject.
Terrific. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and explaining all of that. Suzanne Dibble, data protection lawyer. So if you are running a small business and you're scared, there are websites. She runs one. There are websites out there where you can go to find out what you need to do to be compliant. It is not unduly onerous, but a lot of people are quite scared because you don't hear anything about it. And then you hear, gosh, they might want 20 million from me. So I'm not surprised people are worried. So we're back to there's £2,000 per household that is needed to pay for an ageing population, but Jeremy Hunt thinks we're willing to pay if we feel the money goes straight to the NHS and it's not going to be wasted. And I made the point earlier in response to an SMS message. I said, actually, we should be encouraging people to go privately to lift the burden off the NHS. And Lance in Fulham, you get text of a day, Lance, because you say, "Hi, Nigel, we could all get private medical care for £2,000. So Lance's point is, rather than giving £2,000 to the government, who, of course, can't guarantee it'll go to the NHS, because we don't have tax hypothecation, it goes into a central pot, and rather than trusting them to spend the money, we could get better health care for ourselves for that £2,000. And Lance, tell you what, it's pretty difficult, in my opinion, to argue against that. Do you remember when 11 billion that the NHS wasted on a failed IT system about 8 years ago? I would not trust them with any more money, says Mike in High Wycombe, and yes, they did blow an extraordinary sum of money on a new failed IT system. Ian is calling from Beath up in Glasgow. Good morning, Ian.
Hi, good morning, Nigel. How are you?
I am... Well, I'm all right. I mean, you didn't get the thunderstorms up there, Ian, did you?
No, we did not. We've got Nicola Sturgeon. Do we need any more? There's enough thunder comes out of Hollywood.
Well, you could probably say that of all people in politics, Ian. So, Ian...
I mean, I think I've won the lottery here because I've tried to talk to you so many times in this show, but here we go.
Right, well, you've got through. You finally got through, Ian. The floor is yours. Are you happy to pay a lot more money and trust Jeremy Hunt to spend it well on healthcare?
Absolutely not, because he couldn't run a bath.
Right, but he's a highly university-educated, intelligent man, Ian.
Nigel, there's a saying that those of us who weren't lucky enough to go to university have. It's that those that went to university have loads of brains but no common sense. And I'm telling you, when you look round that government, we've got Scotland, England and Wales. Doesn't matter. There's not a lot of common sense.
but the trouble is, Ian, we've got an ageing population here. We genuinely do. So what are we going to do to provide a reasonable level of care in the years ahead?
Well, Nigel, I'm 75.
Right.
I'm 75, so I'm one of those ageing populations. I think over the 75 years, I've spent no more than 2 weeks in hospital.
Yeah.
And the last time was a couple of years ago when I had 8 days.
Mm-hmm.
Now, had they said to me, we're charging you for food, because if you'd been at home, you'd have had to feed yourself anyway, I would have happily paid it. And I don't see any reason why they shouldn't do that. Say, £5 a day for your food, 8 days in there, £40. You couldn't get a meal outside for £40.
Well, do you know what?
I think they need to look at this in a whole...
Do you know what, Ian? I'd never even thought of that. But as you say, if you were at home, you would be buying food.
Of course you would.
And you might go to the shops and stop for a £3 coffee. Why so many people do that's beyond me, but hey.
And me, Nigel.
I don't understand it. I'd rather invest it somewhere else, in perhaps the public house. But anyway, Ian, you make a great point, and thank you for your call, and well done for getting through. And that's a very, very good point that he makes, isn't it? That actually things like that could perhaps save the NHS a real big lot of money. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It's 11:45. £2,000 per household on our tax bill. Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary, tells us we're willing to do it, provided we're happy the money's going to go straight there and it's not going to get wasted. And it's very difficult for either of those things to be promised to anybody. Rick on Facebook says, following up a theme that we had earlier, NHS chiefs get paid more than our Prime Minister. They should have their pay capped at $50,000 a year. But Rick, what if you got in an NHS chief who was a real hotshot, who understood efficiencies, who got saving money, who dealt with procurement? What if somebody saved millions every year for one of the 400 or so health trusts? Wouldn't you be happy, Rick, in that situation to pay her or him more money? I don't think this is about the pay of any individual, but I think what it is about is a massive growth in middle management. Some think I may have well got that right first time round over the course of the last 20 years. I get this anonymously. I've worked on the front line of the NHS for 15 years, and regardless of which party is in power, there are never enough resources to provide consistent, safe patient care. But just throwing money at the NHS and taxing the British taxpayer won't solve the problem unless the whole system is reviewed and looked at like any other failing business. Too many non-clinical managers, and that's a very, very common complaint from people that work within the National Health Service but are nearly always very reluctant, for understandable reasons, to give their names. The NHS is a colossal bureaucracy. Bureaucracies are inherently wasteful. The more money you give the NHS, the more money that it will go on spending on increasing its own headcount. Some will go to nurses and doctors for sure, but a lot will go to administrators and bureaucracy, which is wasteful. There will never be enough money. Well, no, look, there will never be enough money. It is literally a black hole, because the more money you've got it within it, yes, not just only does the system itself get bigger, but actually with medical technology, the things that people demand from the NHS grow in scope too. So it is kind of endless. Ben is calling from Sydney. Hello, Ben.
Oh, hi, Nigel. Pleasure to talk to you.
Good morning. So is that Sydney, Australia, or?
Yeah, Sydney, Australia. So
right, well, I wasn't sure. Okay, so how do things work there?
Yeah, so my wife and my young son, we pay about $4,300 a year.
Yes.
Private, and then we get a tax rebate at the end of the year, which makes it worthwhile for us.
Yes, that's in Aussie dollars, yeah?
That's Aussie dollars, yeah, so I don't know what the exchange rate, £2,100 or whatever.
Okay, so, yeah, let's call it a couple of grand, yeah. Just for simple. So you spend that money getting your own private care.
Yep.
And you get a tax rebate. But what happens, Ben, if you're, God forbid, but if you're in a road traffic accident, emergency situation, what happens then?
Well, I've chosen, like, the fully covered, so I'm covered. Exactly like I would be back home, apart from it's private. And
is it compulsory to have private, or if you're not in private, if you're not in private, you're in the state system, yeah?
In the state system, yeah.
Right. So you've been okay, I've got it. You've been encouraged through tax incentives to come out. Do you know what, Ben? I have to say, I have talked about this going back a few years, and I've talked about it over the course of the last 50 minutes or so as well, that actually the more people in your position, then actually the freer resources are for the rest of the National Health Service.
I'm Nigel, I'm 27, I'm a carpenter, I'm not a rich person, and it works fantastic for me.
And how long have you been in Oz, Ben?
Coming up 8 years.
Coming up 8 years. And when you first went there, I'm guessing there was no automatic healthcare anyway for you.
Well, it was. I came out here on a backpacking visa, and is it reciprocal healthcare anyway for the first 2 years, and then I got sponsored. And part of my sponsorship visa, actually, which is interesting, is I had to get private healthcare, which should be the case in the UK.
An argument that, since you've left the United Kingdom 8 years ago, an argument that has raged here, as I'm sure you know. Ben, listen, great call. Really, really interesting that, isn't it? You know, that's how the Australians do it. They encourage people to opt out of the state system, take private care. They get some tax incentives for doing it. Have to say, I did suggest that many, many years ago, because I was screamed at by everybody for not supporting the NHS. But actually, the more people opt out of it and do things privately, surely the more resource there is for the NHS itself. Andrew is calling from Loughborough in Leicestershire. Andrew, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. So are you happy to cough up another couple of thousand of your taxes for a wonderful new health service?
I am, and there's a way of doing it which every MP, including Jeremy Hunt, has totally missed here, and my local MP, Nicky Morgan, has as well.
Okay.
Is nobody needs to actually pay any more. We could put £10,000 in more person. And where would this money come from, Jeremy? It would come from this foreign aid budget, which is bloated at £13 billion today. There's so much money there.
Or Andrew, remembering the referendum, once we're not paying membership fees to the EU, that might help a bit too.
Yeah, I had that on my list as well. You're right, but why is nobody waking up in government, and that money needs to be moved today? We need to look after ourselves before we give charity beyond our home at the end of the day.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we stopped our net contribution to the European Union is about 10 billion, although it's going to be going up substantially during this transition period to about 15. Foreign aid as well. Yeah, I mean, look, there is a substantial amount you could do for the National Health Service with that money. But generally, Andrew, the point, of course, is that however much you pour into it, it always wants more anyway.
Oh, totally, and that's what's happened with foreign aid. It's ended up a target, and the more you give them, the more it's wasted at the end of the day. And the same happens a bit with the NHS, with the medicines, inflated prices. We need to wake up. They need to get their head out of the sand, the government, and start taking control of this money, not asking for more. It needs to be more resourced at the end of the day.
Right, so a redirection of how national government spends money, yeah?
Totally a redirection of it. And I've requested with the government that the public should have a say of how this money is actually spent, and they're not interested in any public view on it at all, and I think that's undemocratic.
Difficult, though, isn't it, Andrew, because there are so many different things that government needs to spend money on. To ask people directly for a say on how stuff is... How would you do it?
You would have a vote online to whereby anybody who is a UK taxpayer can actually tick to where it should be spent.
Well, it's do you know what? In one way, it's an extraordinary, liberating idea, but it would produce total chaos, Andrew.
Well, it needs it. You can't go on the way it is, because the money has just been a high percentage. It goes to good causes, but a high percentage is actually squandered, as we all know, and it can't continue.
No, I think we all feel that. Andrew, thank you very much. And Andrew taking tax hypothecation to a level where we'd almost have a referendum on it and where we wanted our money to go. It simply can't work, folks. That's my view. What does Harvey in Hounslow think? Good morning, Harvey.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you, mate?
I'm all right, thank you. So, another 2,000 quid from your household and all our health problems will be fixed.
No, thank you. I've got a report in front of me from the Taxpayers Alliance. It says that in 2014, 120 billion of wasteful spending came from our government.
Yeah.
And according to their statistics, that's 4,500 every week, and it tells you a lot of what it's being spent on, but there's loads of factors. We should stop health tourism as well, really. We don't know how much that costs.
Well, I know, Harvey, but those of us that have made that argument have been denounced as small-minded bigots and evil people.
Oh, I guess I am.
We should open our hearts to a broader world. We should allow anyone in to get healthcare. No, Harvey, I do understand that argument. I mean, one of the things that is coming out of all of this is more and more people thinking that perhaps we need to have entitlement cards that we carry with us for healthcare. Would you go along with that?
No. I think the government's duty is towards its people and not the people of the world. I mean, we elect them, the world doesn't.
But if you had an entitlement card, we'd know who you were, Harvey, wouldn't we?
Well, that's true. Yeah, that is true, actually.
It does have a point. It does have a point. Harvey, I thank you for your call. I thank all of you for your call. Angela on Facebook says, private hospitals don't tend to have an A&E. No, Angela, which is why I asked the question. And even if we're encouraged to opt out and get private healthcare to relieve the burden on the NHS, if we were doing that solely, we would still need accident and emergency. And that point is absolutely valid and true. You've been listening to the Sunday show here with me, Nigel Farage. I'm back tomorrow night at 7 o'clock from Strasbourg. At 3 this afternoon, it's Andrew Castle. But up next, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel.